I can't give you a map that's going to show you the precise borders of where Nahom was in Lehi's day. But we have the evidence generally says they're in the same approximate location.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Your host, David Snell, speaking in the third person, is here today with Neal Rappleye. Neal, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
It's been, we were just talking about how this is your first time on the show, which
Correct.
is a shame, but we're glad you're here.
I'm really excited to be here. Always, I've been a big fan of your work, especially. I consider you a friend. I don't know if you return that favor, but I consider you a friend, David.
Yes.
So I'm super excited to be here.
An honor to be called a friend. So give us a little bit of background about yourself before we jump into today's topic. A little educational family background.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. How far back should we go? Well, I was born in Colorado Springs, Colorado. No, just kidding. We don't need to go through it. I currently work at Scripture Central, formerly known as Book of Mormon Central. Right. I am the head or lead of our research department. So I oversee pretty much anything or any projects we have going on that has research related to the ancient world and scripture and things like that. I kind of oversee that work, and I'm most directly involved myself, and this is what I've been doing. I was originally hired to when they launched Book of Mormon Central to work on the Know Whys. Know Whys are basically these short articles that provide a little contextual background into something in Scripture. And we call it a Know Why and we think we're clever, so we made that into a word. But we call it that because what we do is we give you this contextual background that we want you to know, right? And then we have a section where we explain why that helps you better understand something in the scriptures, or why it helps you better live the gospel and apply it into your life, or whatever the case may be. Because I think what happens a lot of times is some of these discussions about ancient stuff in scholarly publications and whatnot get a little technical, get a little dry, and it can be hard for the average Latter-day Saint to be like, okay, so why does this actually matter to me, right? And so we want to distill that down into something that's more digestible, and that also is more directly relatable, helps you understand why, like, knowing that helps you live the gospel, helps you better understand the scriptures, helps you bolster your faith in Jesus Christ, whatever the case may be in a particular, situation. So that's kind of what I've been doing for like the last almost 10 years now. I guess it's been 9 years since 2015.
Great. Thank you for that background. So we're studying the Book of Mormon this year in Come Follow Me. And right at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, we get this great journey that Lehi and his family take from Jerusalem to the coastline and then across the ocean to the Americas. On our channel, we really haven't talked a whole lot about that journey in the old world that they took out of Jerusalem. And you have done quite a bit of research on this topic. So I want to talk specifically about Nahom, a place called Nahom.
Yeah.
Maybe tell us what the significance of Nahom is in the Book of Mormon, and then tell us kind of what your research has turned up as far as that location goes in the actual real world, if that makes sense.
Sure. So in First Nephi, during Lehi's journey, you see, as you read along, right, you have Lehi, they stop at a valley, right? And what Lehi does is he names that valley, and he names the river in that valley, and he names it himself, and the text is really explicit about that. And then they go to another stop, and they name it themselves again. They call it Shazer, right? And this is kind of the pattern in First Nephi. As they come to different places, the family is explicitly said to have named the place. What's significant about Nahom is when they get there, it's named. It's the place where Ishmael is buried. So Nephi tells us it's First Nephi 16:34 that Ishmael died and was buried at the place which was called Nahom.
So they don't give it
So they don't appear to give the name Nahom to the location. And this is just a few verses after, this is like 20 verses after they explicitly are said to have named Shazer. And then it's like maybe 10 or so verses into, like, you got like 5 more verses in chapter 16. And then it's like 17:5, chapter 17, verse 5. They're explicitly naming Bountiful. They're explicitly naming Iriantum. And even if you go into 2nd Nephi and they split up, right, and Nephi leads his people, and then they stop and they explicitly name the city and the land after Nephi, right?
Yeah.
Every other name, every other toponym, every other place name in the whole text is being explicitly given. This is something that was noticed a long time ago, by the way. Hugh Nibley actually pointed it out in his series Lehi in the Desert in the 1950s.
Wow.
And then when Lynn and Hope Hilton, they were actually sent to Arabia on assignment to kind of document Lehi's trail. And so they started doing research. This was like in 1976.
Is this assignment by the church?
Yeah, well, by like the Ensign, the church magazines department or something, right? Because they were sent over there to get photos and to kind of document the trail for a series on the Ensign, because they were about to do a Book of Mormon year in Sunday school. So look, we're doing the same thing now, right?
Yeah.
We all revisit Lehi's trail when this time of year comes around. But as they were researching, they noticed, they were like, yeah, it seems like they maybe encountered other people and they must have learned that name from them. And this is 1976. But none of them actually knew anything about any sort of location that had a similar name. But the possibility was kind of raised here that we could potentially find documentation for that location. It might exist. I mean, it's a long time to tell the whole story. It's a long time before I come onto the scene, because we're in the 1970s right now. But long story short, a couple years later, there actually is a map that's discovered that has the name Nahom on it. And people look at this map and they're like, hey, it's actually not too far off from where the Hiltons kind of mapped Lehi's route in the first place. And so this could be the Nahom of the Book of Mormon.
So how do you connect Nahom and Nahom? Just because they sound different.
Yeah. So so the source that has Nahom in it that we're actually talking about, it's actually an old 18th century map from I think he's a German cartographer or something like that. And he was the first person from the Western world to actually go to Yemen and travel there. And he actually talks about in his writings, he talks about how hard and indistinct the pronunciation of names were. And so he kind of explains, my spellings are best guesses, right? He's doing best guess spellings. And you can actually find documentation of this name in a variety of sources. I've actually found like 19 different ways, or I think 18, 17 different ways I've seen this name spelled. Sometimes with an A, like Nahom, or Nahom and things like that. It's spelled a variety of different ways. What's consistent and constant are the consonants, the N, the H, and the M. And what's important about that is in Semitic languages, ancient Semitic languages, they didn't write vowels. They didn't have characters for the vowel letters. They just wrote the consonants. So if this name were written anciently, it would just be written N-H-M. If Nahom were written anciently, if we could dig up the plates somehow, right, magically find them, all Nephi would have put on there is characters in his Egyptian script that would have represented NHM. So from a Semitic linguistic sort of background, that is as on target as you can get. The vowels vary they vary variously, depending on how people choose to render or translate it. And like I said, I've found like 17 different ways or 18 different ways that it's been spelled in various sources. And so I look at that and I see the Book of Mormon spelling Nahom as one more variant spelling.
Gotcha. That's good context. So even though somebody might pronounce it Nahom or Nahom, it's as close as you can get.
Yeah. Again, epigraphically speaking, where this is ultimately going, right, is we find inscriptions eventually, right? After the map's been found, the criticism is, oh, well, that doesn't prove it was there in 600 BC. Well, Warren Aston, he does a bunch of research, finds way more documentation for this name, finds out that it's the name of a tribal group in the area, and tribal groups lend, regions where tribes live tend to be named after those tribes, especially in northern Yemen. In fact, I had a paper in BYU Studies that just addressed this, because lots of people are like, oh, it's a tribe, not a place. It's both. It's both a tribe and a place, and tribes are the name of the regions are named after the tribe that lives there in a lot of the ancient Near East, but especially in Yemen. And so Warren Aston is able to document the name back into antiquity, but not quite to 600 BC. And then Kent Brown comes along, and he's the first one to actually notice inscriptions that date to the 7th century BC that have this tribal name on them, NHM, or it's technically, it's the name of, it's a specific individual who's being identified as a Nahomite, an NHMite, if you will. So a member of the Nahom tribe, or a person from the Nahom region. The same way you might speak of, like in a biblical context, a Judahite, right? Or an Israelite. These are people who are from the house of Israel or from the tribe of Judah, but they can also be someone who's from the region of Judah or from the area of Israel, right? So these are found on inscriptions going back to the 7th century BC by Kent Brown.
And these inscriptions are where? Are these in...
They're in, so the inscriptions that Kent Brown specifically found are in a town, a very ancient town in Yemen called Merib.
Okay.
And Merib was the capital of the Sabian kingdom. The Sabian kingdom being the same kingdom where, like, the Queen of Sheba, in the Bible it's called Sheba, right? So the Queen of Sheba is from Saba, or the Sabian kingdom, down in southern Arabia. And this is the kind of the capital of the Sabian kingdom, is Merib. And there's there's a temple structure there where people would make votive offerings. And all that really means is they would, like, have either a statue or an altar or something with an inscription dedicating it to their god, right? And they would make this offering in the temple. And that's what, these are on altars that were votive offerings to the temple. And they have this inscription from a man named Biathtar, who's identified as a Nahomite. So that's the big lead up, I guess. And scholars identify that as being a rendering of the same name, Nahom, and referring to this tribe in that region. So that kind of proved it went back to Lehi's day.
So we've got the name that fits.
Yeah.
And it fits in the right time, not time zone, but time era
time period.
Time
yeah.
period.
Yeah.
Geographically, I don't have a map of Yemen in my head. Where does these inscriptions, are these found right along where we would assume Lehi would have traveled, or have we not gotten there yet?
So, this is actually where a lot of confusion, I think, creeps up into the conversation.
Okay.
Because some people, they look at those, they think that those inscriptions, they see them at Merib and they think that's where Nahom is. That's not correct, right? Nahom is not in Merib. The region of Nahom in Yemen is to the west of Merib. It's in kind of this mountainous area. It's south of an area. None of this is going to mean anything to you guys, but it's south of this area called Wadi Jaf, which is this.
Yes, Wadi Jaf.
Yes. It's this
wonderful place.
It's this big. The Wadi Jaf is like just a big, giant valley that cuts between the northern Yemen mountains and the southern plateau, basically. And the Nahom region is in the mountainous area just to the south of the Wadi Jaf. And it's just to the west of Merib. Okay, and so the inscriptions themselves, that specific inscription, is not found in that region, but scholars who study ancient Arabia, they look at that inscription, and by the way, there's actually several other inscriptions. This is something I've talked about more in some of my own publications, is we have more inscriptions than just these 3 altars that were first discovered that attest to the tribe and region in pre-Islamic times. And scholars who study these inscriptions, they consistently identify them as referring to the same tribe and geographically being located in the same approximate region. We can't, I can't give you a map that's going to show you the precise borders of where Nahom was in Lehi's day. But we have the evidence generally says they're in the same approximate location.
So scholars have kind of taken all these scattered puzzle pieces and from those kind of triangulated a location for where they think that this kind of tribal region was.
Yeah. So, in fact, this is actually where some of my research comes in because, I wanted to get a better idea of what we could or couldn't say about where they were in antiquity. And so one of the things I turned up in my research when I started digging into this topic, this was something I was actually fascinated by this since ninth grade or something like that, because my seminary teacher came in and read a thing in the Ensign about them finding these altars with the name Nahom on them. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. Now, that doesn't mean I started doing research in ninth grade, obviously.
This is your ninth grade report on Nahom that we're getting into.
But it's been something that's fascinated me since then. But it wasn't until I got back from my mission and had an opportunity to actually work in this area, right, that I really had an opportunity to dig in and do some research. But we have early Islamic period geographers who talk about the geography and tribal boundaries and stuff like that in Yemen. And one of them is, I'm not going to try to say his full name because it's a mouthful, but he's generally referred to as Hamdani because that's his last name, right? He provides a lot of pretty extensive detail about the Nahom tribe and where they're located. And in his geography, he actually has two locations for them. One is in that same general area to the south of what's known as the Wadi Jaf and to the west of Marib. And then the other is in the mountains just to the north of the Wadi Jaf. And so there's actually kind of, you can map these two territories. And in fact, I've published maps that show the regions based on how he describes them. And it's not me who's saying this. I'm actually drawing from another scholar who provided maps, and I'm kind of copying their maps, and I credit them in my sources. So I'm not plagiarizing their maps, but I'm basing my maps off of his maps. So, but you can see where these two regions are, and they're pretty close to each other. They're just basically, they're right across this valley. And most scholarly commentary that I've been able to find on the inscriptions that refer to the NHM people, right, or region, will identify it as being in one of those two locations. So we know that they're somewhere within that same general range that they were in the early Islamic period back into antiquity.
And these regions are right along the path of Lehi?
Yeah. In fact, so Latter-day Saint research is primarily focused on that southern region because that's really all we've known about. And most people, when they talk about Lehi going to Nahom or whatever, that's the southern region is what they're kind of thinking about. The northern region, though, is kind of interesting to me for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is if you actually map the route that the Hiltons came up with in the 1970s, if not have topographically satellite imaged maps that they produced and provided for the Ensign article, right?
Sure.
And so I had to do a bunch of extra research to kind of figure out where their route was really going and what ancient trails they were basing it on and stuff like that. And once I had kind of reconstructed all of that and put it onto a satellite accurate map, the trail system that they're using actually goes right to the northern corner of the northern Nahom region. And then that's where it would go eastward after that. So I thought it was really interesting. They didn't know anything about that region when they made their map, when they kind of hypothesized about where Lehi would have gone and whatnot. And so I thought it was actually really interesting that it turns out, even without knowing it, they actually led Lehi right into the Nahom region.
Yeah.
With the route they were following.
That's fascinating.
So what we know from the text about Lehi's route is that he goes in a south-southeast direction. And we have a pretty good idea of where that starts because we get specific day numbers, right? They go 3 days and then they go 4 days. And we have really good candidates for their stops at the Valley of Lemuel and the Valley, or not the, but, and Shazer, right? We have really good candidates for those. And even if you don't agree with those specific identifications, the strict number of days traveled means it's going to be right around there either way.
Give you pretty solid boundaries.
Right. And so we know that their approximate location with Shazer, the best candidate we have so far is Wadi Sharma in Saudi Arabia, Northwest Arabia. And again, if you don't agree with that, fine. They're going to be somewhere in that ballpark though. And so you've got to be able to go generally southeast from there to get to wherever Nahom is. Mm-hmm. And you've got to be able to travel many days. And that's super vague. But then what we do know is you have to be able to turn east. Because after they bury Ishmael, the next thing Nephi tells us is we went nearly eastward from that time forth. And not only do you have to be able to turn east, but you have to be able to turn east and you have to be able to end up at a point that can fit the description of bountiful in the Book of Mormon.
Which is not a particularly... It's not a very... you don't have a whole lot of options in the middle of the Arabian desert.
It's not... It's not super easy to just randomly pick a spot to turn east and you have a sure bet that you're going to land at the coast at a region that will fit the description of bountiful. Right. I won't say it's impossible, but it's not a likely thing, if you're just randomly guessing. And so scholars already knew the best potential location for bountiful was in the Dhofar region of Oman, right? And this is something Hugh Nibley already was talking about in the 1950s. This is something the Hiltons were already talking about. Specific locations within the Dhofar region, you get a little debate. You've got the Hiltons really liked Salalah. Warren Aston came along and he said, no, Salalah's no good. We want... he thinks it's Kor Kafot in a little to the west of that area. And then George Potter comes along and he comes... and he studies it, and he says, no, I think it's actually Kor Rory, which is a little to the east. And those are kind of the two candidates now that are being actively promoted, investigated, researched. And I'm not going to stake a pin on the map in one of those. The point is the Dhofar region in general, that's kind of the people had already settled on. That's where bountiful needs to be before they knew anything about Nahom. All right. And so what's important about that, though, is the Dhofar region is also the main incense producing region. And so in antiquity, the incense trade was moving goods east-west from Dhofar over into Yemen and the South Arabian kingdoms there. And then they were moving them along a north-south axis that's really more of a southeast-northwest axis, right? Up Arabia into the rest of the ancient Near East. And we actually have, this is something that I bring up in some of my research because no one had talked about it for the Book of Mormon before, but we have an inscription that some scholars date right to Lehi's day that talks about someone going up from South Arabia to Judah and doing trade, doing commercial relations in the cities of Judah, it says. So we know right in Lehi's day that there is commerce going back and forth between these regions.
There's some kind of trail.
Yeah, exactly. The trail is there. And you can't put a pin in the map or trace every single aspect of the trail all the way back to 600 BC. But I actually, in my most recent article that published in Interpreter, I actually go through ancient inscriptions that show us that between, say, the 7th and the 5th century we can document the whole, the southeastward and the eastward part of the trail, like 80% of it, in inscriptions that fall within like 150 years of Lehi's time.
So essentially, if you've got Joseph Smith just making stuff up, it's pretty crazy that he would basically take Lehi and his family through all these very plausibly situated locations along a trail that existed along this general route. It's pretty crazy that he would just guess all that correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. A lot of people would think so.
Some people would disagree.
I think what's particularly crazy about it, because I think There's a difference between being able to like guess stuff and not only being able to have it turn out to be true, but being able to document it right in Lehi's time, right? I think that makes a huge difference. People kind of want to be like, some people want to say Joseph could have known about some of the maps about that have Nahom on them. It's like, maybe. I think that's a stretch, but even if he did, there are like hundreds and maybe even thousands of names on these maps. Yeah. And how many of them, and Nahum's not the only one, but how many of those names can actually be traced back into antiquity right to Lehi's day? So if Joseph Smith is randomly pulling a name off this map, what are the odds that the one he randomly picks goes back to antiquity? Now, I haven't done the math to determine those odds.
Yeah.
I suspect it's not very plausible, though. I mean, like I said, I would love to see someone work that out. I'd be curious to see what the probability is. But more importantly, this trail that I'm talking about, that's not documented on any of these maps. And this turn where the east-west axis of trade and the north-south axis of trade, where that turn happens is right around that area I mentioned, Wadi Jaf, where the Nahom tribe has kind of bordered that area the entire time, as far back as we can document their exact borders, right? So, and we can document, like I said, early Islamic sources is the earliest we can document their exact borders, and they're in that region. They're bordering that Wadi Jaf area. And scholars think they're in that same general area in antiquity, at least all the scholars I was able to find who commented on it. And there's 3 different trails that break off to go eastward, and all of them are maybe 2 of them are right within the Nahom, like right at the boundaries of the Nahom tribe on either the north or the south. And then the one in the middle is like maybe 10 or 15 miles away from their earliest borders. So basically, the location of the Nahom tribe is basically right where we know ancient trails going southeast turn eastward. We can't pin down Lehi's exact GPS location all the time, right? And that's what some people want to be able to do. But based on the directions that we're given and based on what we have anciently documented as trails that you can actually travel, and whether they followed the exact route of these trade routes or whatever, their existence tells us that going in those directions, you can get access to food and water, and you can survive in the wilderness for 8 years, like it says Lehi and his family did. Yeah. And there's nowhere else along the Arabian Peninsula that you can make a turn and go nearly eastward. So basically, however he gets there, this has to be the area they are at when they make this nearly eastward turn. And this is what leads to the area Dhofar, right? The Dhofar area, where we know the only locations anyone's found that fit Bountiful.
And it's interesting because it makes sense to me that they would be along some kind of established trail. When I was a kid, I just thought, they wandered, because they talk about wandering into the wilderness. I just thought, they went off randomly into the wilderness. But it makes sense that they were on kind of a trail for a lot of reasons. But one, like in the Book of Mormon, it talks about how they're not using fire.
Yeah.
Which kind of suggests that there were other people around.
Yeah.
At least sometimes that would potentially be able to see that fire and find them. So maybe the last thing I want to talk about has to do with some of your research on a guy named Ishmael. You mentioned Ishmael is buried, according to the Book of Mormon, in the Nahom region. Maybe talk just a little bit about what you've kind of discovered regarding that.
Yeah, so actually, as I was doing some of my research, honestly, I was just looking for more inscriptions, see if I could find more inscriptions that referred to the Nahom tribe. As I was going through different corpuses of South Arabian inscriptions and stuff, and just looking to see if they had any references to this NHM people, the Nahom, I came across a collection of what are academically termed funerary stelae, or stela would be the singular, stelae the plural, right? This was a collection. It was like something like 400 and something funerary stelae, which again, that's an academic term. They're gravestones, right? They're tombstones. These are ancient tombstones. So And it's a collection of tombstones that are believed to have come from the Wadi Jaf region.
Which is the Nahom region.
Which is so it's the region that the Nahom tribe has been in and bordered their entire history, right?
Sure.
And so I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I looked through the corpus to see if the name Nahom showed up. It didn't. And so then I thought, well, maybe these would be kind of interesting to study to give us like some contextual background on burial practices in the area where Ishmael was buried. And that might be kind of cool to help us understand maybe something about how Ishmael might have been buried. So I like filed it away in my files, which were a complete mess and were not and still aren't well organized, and kind of forgot about it. I thought, oh, all right, cool. But it was like a week later that I'm going through my messily organized files and I find that collection of funerary stela again. And I had completely forgotten about it. And so I was like, oh, what is this? And it's these tombstones. They're in the same region where Ishmael was buried. So maybe they could be useful for giving us contextual background sometime. I don't know. I kind of went through the introductory material in the catalog of these inscriptions and stuff that was, written by the scholars who collected it. That could be interesting. And then like I moved on. I was looking for something else at the time. And the thought hit me. I was like, wait a second. There are names. There are names on these tombstones. I thought I wonder if any of them have the name Ishmael on them. Like
that would be wild.
Just shot in the dark. Like, yeah.
What are the chances?
What are the chances? And so I did a little research to understand what the name Ishmael would look like in South Arabian script and how it would be transcribed by scholars, right? And then I went to the index of names in this corpus of inscriptions. And sure enough, there was the name. Again, like I said, no vowels in the way these are written. So there was YSM. And then there are two little like hook marks that represent like glottal stops or gutter. They actually do kind of represent vowels, guttural vowels. In the name Ishmael, they represent that A and E, right? These two little hook marks and then an L. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. So there was a few of them. There were like 6 of them. And then I said, well, I wonder if any of them date to the right time period, to the time period when Ishmael and when Lehi would have been burying Ishmael. And literally it was like the last one. I went through 5 of them and they were all from after 400 BC. They were all later. And the very last one I looked up was dated to the 6th to 5th century BC. And then I did a little more research on it, and I found, so it was dated paleographically. That just means like they looked at the script and they analyzed the script and they're, this writing style is consistent with the 6th to 5th century BC. But in the introductory material, they identify that particular stela as being representative of the artistic style of the 7th to 6th century BC. So I kind of split the difference. I assume it's probably a 6th century BC stela. And Lehi's time in Nahom when they bury Ishmael, that would have been the early 6th century BC. So can we pin down an exact year? No, but we can say in the general time period, about the time that Lehi was there and their family was burying someone named Ishmael, we have a tombstone that says someone named Ishmael was buried in that area.
That's wild. That's wild. Have you gotten a lot of, because that's one of those claims where like members are like, that's really cool. And maybe some critics are like, no way.
Yeah.
Have you gotten a lot of pushback?
Yeah. So I do want to go on record and be clear. I have never claimed that this is Ishmael from the Book of Mormon's tombstone. And I don't believe we can know that. And that's kind of the biggest pushback is, well, number one, Ishmael's a common name in the ancient Near East. And actually, in my paper, I did some research and talked about that. It's actually a very, very popular name in Jerusalem at the time, which is kind of interesting. If you're going to make up a story in the 19th century about people coming from Jerusalem, Ishmael maybe wouldn't be the most intuitive name to pick because, the Ishmaelites are the historical enemies of the Israelites, right? And but Ishmael is actually really well attested in stamp seals and things like that from Judah between the 8th and the 6th century. It's considered one of the most popular names of the time period for Israelites. Down in South Arabia, there are, I believe I found, and I'm quoting off the top of my head, so if I'm off by a number or two, I apologize. Don't come at me in the comments. But I think what I found in a database of over 8,500 inscriptions with names and things like that on them, I found like 26 or 27 examples of the name Ishmael in South Arabia. And you'll see the way they translate it, they actually render it through South Arabian script. They render it Yasmael. But it's the same etymologically it's the same name, right? And they're not writing the vowels. But I think there's 26 or 27 attestations out of over 8,000 inscriptions in South Arabia. And of those, only 4 of them date to the early 1st millennium BC. So it's actually not a super common name in South Arabia in that time period. So that's kind of number one. Yes, it's certainly a known name, and it's common in the ancient Near East generally, and in the Israelite region in particular. So again, you can't prove that it's the Ishmael from the Book of Mormon, but it's not super common in South Arabia,
where he's found,
where this stela is found. And what's particularly interesting is in the research on these particular stela, there is some debate about who the people are that they represent, because they all have just a name on them. They don't have they're not like these altars that I was talking about where there's like a whole inscription, a dedicatory inscription or anything like that. And when we find like really wealthy cemeteries and tombstones in Marib or other places in Yemen, there are these elaborate carvings with long inscriptions and stuff like that. And these are just these like really crudely carved, elongated, rectangular shaped stela with like a crude face on them, and then a single name. There's no, usually you'd expect like a patronym so that you would be able to know like what family they were part of, or you might expect their tribal name to be able to identify, what group they're part of, right? There's nothing like that. There's just a name. And so scholars have been really perplexed, like who are these people? Where are they coming from? What communities are they associated with? And the debate has there's kind of 2 camps. On the one hand, you've got people who think they're foreigners, which is interesting because
they were foreigners.
Southern Arabian
in the
Peninsula. Southern Arabian area. You've got people who think they're foreigners. And these people have talked about how the onomastics, that's just a big academic way to say the names have a lot of affinities to Northern Arabian names, and in some cases, Northwest Arabian names, and even in a couple cases, Mesopotamian names. And so they're looking at all those names, and they're saying, we think these were probably people with foreign ties. Maybe they were staying there locally, or something, but they're people with foreign ties. And among the kind of mix of people they think it might have included like caravaneers and stuff like that, people who are traveling along this trade route that we were just talking about, that scholars think Lehi is traveling on. The other position is that they're just the poor, right? They're just the poor people living in South Arabia who can't afford a big, elaborate, fancy thing. And so they just get these cheap, crude tombstones instead. At this point, the evidence can't really settle it for sure, but even the people who argue that it's the local underclass, the local poor class, there's even they say, yeah, some of them might have been foreigners, people traveling along the trade route, people, basically people who aren't at home and don't have the resources to do an elaborate burial for themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, basically most scholars agree that some of them are probably foreigners. Maybe not all of them are, but some of them are probably foreigners. There's one that is definitely a Babylonian woman. The scholars who say that are ones who really advocate for these being the poor in the area rather than just being foreigners. So, but even they're like, yeah, this one's clearly a Babylonian woman because we can tell it's a Mesopotamian name. It's unattested anywhere else. So this is the type of stela. If they did do a proper burial for Ishmael and they were to get him some sort of tombstone, it probably would have been something like this, right? I guess another pushback that I've gotten is people point out it's not written in Hebrew, right? It's written in South Arabian. So why would Lehi's family have done a stela that's in this Arabian style and written in an Arabian script? And my answer to that is they're not stone carvers. So they maybe couldn't have done it themselves, right? We haven't.
They got the local street artist.
They need someone local who can carve the stone. And like I said, scholars think they're foreigners, even though the script is South Arabian. So, my working theory would be something like someone from the Nahom tribe is helping them bury Ishmael, right? And in fact, Nahom, the NHM root in South Arabian means stone carver or stonemason. So
they probably had a few of those around.
So they probably had a few of those in the tribe. And Ishmael's stone, if they did have a stone for him, it could have been something like this, and it probably would have been carved by a local stone carver rather than someone in the family.
I'm wondering, through all this academic research and whatnot, how has this influenced your testimony of the Book of Mormon?
As far as like believing in the Book of Mormon goes, like I don't need any of the evidence to believe it, right? Like, and I don't. People are gonna think that sounds crazy or I'm biased or whatever. But for me, that actually, I feel like that's always like really kind of freed me up to be like to be impartial about proposed evidence, right? People propose something as evidence, and I don't feel like I need to cling to it for my belief, and so I feel like I can, if it's not very good, I can reject it, and I don't have to follow it. So I believe it, and I have faith in it. But what all of this does for me is it brings it to life in very real ways. Researching the Arabian Peninsula and the Trail and the Nahom tribe, it gives me all kinds of visuals for the sights and sounds and things that Lehi would have seen on his trail. And it helps bring this life, and you better understand like the struggles and the difficulties. So let me actually give an example here. The daughters of Ishmael, right? They're mourning the loss of their father, and they're talking about suffering affliction, and they're talking about suffering from hunger, thirst, and fatigue, and all of this stuff. Well, you do all this research on ancient Arabia, and you understand the kind of terrain they're traveling through, the regions they're traveling through, how barren all of this is. And the region before you get to the Wadi Jaf in particular is very barren. It is some of the hardest, roughest terrain they would have had to pass through. And so suddenly you're like, okay, I'm understanding more about this complaint that they have, because we can situate it geographically, and we have things that start to come alive here. You understand too what they had ahead of them, because like I said, there are these eastward trails, right? But they're cutting across, the most directly eastward route cuts across two deserts, two absolute barren deserts, and that's where they're headed next. They're going to get to Bountiful, but they're going to pass through some really rough terrain before they get there. And it brings a lot of this to life. And like I said, whether the stela that I found is the Ishmael from the Book of Mormon or not, this gives us a visual of what they might have buried him with. There's lots of, in addition to tombstones, there's lots of actual tombs that have been found in the region, right? And that's one of the things a lot of people talk about, is there are burial areas in the Nahom tribal area and stuff like that. And so we can get a sense of, okay, what might they have constructed to bury Ishmael, the care they might have taken to ensure he had some kind of proper burial. Again, I don't know. I don't know that it's the Book of Mormon Ishmael, but it gives us something to think about here that maybe brings these people to life a little bit. We have an artistic depiction of a face that was an Ishmael, was someone named Ishmael who died in that area. It just brings it to life to me in ways that
contextualizes the story. That's fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you, Neal, for sharing all of this. If people want to find more about this, where can they go?
Well, there's a lot of places you could go. I have papers in Interpreter on this. The Ishmael Stela is specifically in Interpreter. I have a big, long paper I just published on Nahom in Interpreter. I also have a paper in BYU Studies on whether or not Nahom is a tribe or a place. But you can also go to Book of Mormon Central. And almost anything on Book of Mormon Central that's talking about Nahom, I wrote it, even though it's not my name on it all the time because it's Book of Mormon Central stuff. And Evidence Central, our sister site there, you can go there and learn about more about Nahom and Lehi's Trail and stuff. And again, I'm kind of the resident expert on that stuff there, so I end up writing most of that stuff. So.
Is there a way people can contact you directly?
If you fill out the contact form asking questions about this on at Book of Mormon Central, it'll get to me. Okay. So
cool. Neal, thank you for being with us. Everyone, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.